Kia ora everybody, my name is Aly and I am nursing a bit of a head cold at the moment, so I apologise. This combined with my New Zealand accent may make it quite difficult for you to understand me, but let's just do our best with what we've got today. And I apologise, it does come in and out at the moment, so I may lose it for a few seconds. So my name is Aly, and I work for the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Agency. I am a practitioner, but I'm also a professional. I'm a self-proclaimed pracademic. I'm a volunteer with Land Search and Rescue New Zealand, both operationally in the field, but also as an IMT member. I teach the incident command systems and leadership for Land Search and Rescue New Zealand. And I'm also a PhD candidate with the Joint Centre of Disaster Research at Massey University. So what I try to do with my research, what I try to do with my practicality, and what I try to do in my day-to-day work is to bring all of those three elements together. So you'll find this presentation today isn't very academically heavy. However, what I do is I take as much of the academic knowledge that I have and I try to put it in as many lay terms as possible so that anyone can understand it, anybody can relate to it. So please bear with me. There are references throughout the slides, so if you do want more information around it, then please, by all means, take a look. So just what we'll cover today, this is really going to have an Aotearoa New Zealand kind of overview and context about it, because this is what we're doing, this is how it relates to us, and I'm really keen to hear on whether you are finding the same themes in your areas as well. So we'll be looking at just a quick overview of emergency management in New Zealand. We'll be looking at the SAR operations, or our SAR missions that we tend to have in New Zealand. The challenges of these climate-related disasters, because we are seeing an increase of these, as well as collaborative strategies, integration with community and volunteer management, which I know there's a lot of discussions out there around spontaneous volunteers, so we'll touch on that a little bit. The adaptation to climate change and climate-related disasters, as well as some recommendations from our perspective, the world according to Aly, should we say. So those of you who are not familiar with Aotearoa New Zealand, this is just a basic rundown. 75% of our population live within 10 kilometres of the coastline, and the rest of them generally live on rivers and lakes. So from that alone, any kind of increase in any climate-related disaster, climate-related issues, we're going to see a huge impact on our populations, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We have these beautiful mountains, and then they normally border the ocean or the lakes. We've got really open farmland, all on floodplains, and all of our coastal areas are, of course, very rugged, very beautiful. You take a look at our capital city, and we build on these really steep slopes in some really interesting areas. So it makes us very susceptible to any climate-related disasters. Within emergency management in New Zealand, we call it civil defence emergency management. Some people call it civil protection. For you guys in the USA, it's FEMA. So I technically work for the state version of FEMA. But we have our National Emergency Management Agency. We then have our different levels from a regional, local, and an incident level, our ICP levels. But recently we've incorporated community into our response because, of course, the first person or the first people to respond to any kind of emergency is community. So we've started to recognise that they play a major role in any kind of response. And so we have begun to acknowledge it, but we're still exploring what that could potentially look like. When it comes to search and rescue missions in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it actually sits under the Ministry of Transport. So Civil Defence Emergency Management, Ministry of Transport, sit in separate areas. So they're not as coordinated as what they could potentially be. And with that, we've got the New Zealand Search and Rescue Council, the New Zealand Search and Rescue Secretariat, which sits under that, and Matt, who's here today, he's works for them. We've then got the NGOs, and that includes Coast Guard New Zealand, Surf Lifesaving New Zealand, Land Search and Rescue New Zealand, which Tony, who you guys met this morning, he's represents Land Search and Rescue New Zealand, and then we've got the Aotearoa Radio Emergency Communications, which is all of your ham radio operators. So they are what make up our volunteers within the search and rescue sector in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But this is all important stuff. I'm getting to a point. What we've seen over the years is, bearing in mind, majority of our legislation came in 2002 and 2015. But what we are seeing is an increase in climate-related disasters, mainly in the forms of cyclones, which have cascading events such as flooding, or we'll just have severe weather events which cause flooding. We have low pressure systems which cause inundation of water into our low-lying sea levels. And we don't have the facilities to be able to manage these. So we quite often find ourselves in air shelters, working out of air shelters as emergency management professionals and as volunteers or unpaid professionals. So we all tend to work together. And this is a perfect example. So 2014, we had no declared states of emergency in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we look back to last year, we had, I think it was 49, 90 days we were in a declared state of emergency. And so far we're, quarter of a way through 2024, and we've already been in a state of emergency for 49 days. So we're tracking to be up here. As we speak, we have a severe weather system hitting the western coast of New Zealand. So we're getting updates constantly on what's happening there, and we're having a lot of our emergency managers and our SAR teams are being deployed. When you look at this graph, there is a bit of one thing you see you've got pandemic over here. When we talk about declared states of emergencies, if we're in a national state of emergency, it means that anything local is null and void. So during the pandemic, we had multiple severe flooding events, but because we were in a national state of emergency, we just recorded the national state of emergency. So if it wasn't for the pandemics and the fires, you'd still see this very steady increase of climate-related emergencies. So we are seeing, and just like everywhere, I'm sure you guys are the same, we're seeing an increase in these frequencies of these events. We're also seeing an increase in intensity. As a result of this, the unpredictability that's related to it and the uncertainty, so that creates a lot of anxiety within our communities. It also means that even as emergency management personnel, it's really hard to be able to redeploy resources in areas unless you're redeploying in really large quantities over a vast space of area. So it makes that planning really difficult. We often find that after these types of events, a lot of people in the industry leave. So it's about 50% after each major event, and that kind of shows you two things, is that one, these types of events are really stressful. Two, we're probably not supporting our people the way that we need to. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that we just don't have these processes in place. If we take a look back at that slide, legislation was built in here. That's when we recruited most of our emergency management advisors or emergency management officers. That's when we had funding regimes for our search and rescue teams. But we haven't actually looked at this and increased those resources since then. But we've seen a threefold increase in these types of events. So our people aren't supported. They're not supported in equipment. They're not supported in personnel. They're not supported in training. And I can say that as someone on the front line, it's certainly something that we see every day. We do get that cascading effect as well. So it mightn't be a flood event, it might be a drought event. And we're starting to see this more and more in New Zealand, which is very uncommon because we're quite known for rain. But we're getting some of our dry areas are starting to just really dry up in those summer periods. So that means that we're having a flow-on effect into our cropping seasons. As a result of that, that's having financial implications with some of our communities. And then, of course, the cascading effects that come as a result of that. In any events, we see these disproportionately impacted people. And because we are search and rescue, we are representatives of our communities. And so as a result of that, a lot of these disproportionately impacted people may be people within our own SAR squads as well. Environment degeneration, degradation. This is something that I'm working on as a separate project at the moment, particularly around terrain-based probability in the search and rescue world, because what we're finding is after a lot of these kind of climate-related disasters, we're seeing our topo and our environment change so drastically that when we send search teams into certain areas to go search, the terrain that they're looking at on a map doesn't actually reflect where they are. So there's a lot of work happening in the background there at the moment, and what we can be doing to ensure the health and safety of our teams, but also knowing where we can be looking for people. Limited resources and coordination, I think that's probably something that happens for all of us in every SAR group. We constantly feel like we're screaming out for resources and trying to work the best we can with other agencies, other groups across our regions and our states and our districts. And of course, this increase in frequency of results in that disaster fatigue, that comes back to personnel, like I was saying before, but it also means that when we're trying to do any kind of SAR prevention or any kind of prevention around preparedness, people just don't want to listen. And so that makes our jobs really, really difficult further down the line when something does happen. So from a New Zealand perspective, like I was saying before, we tend to have our search and rescue and our emergency management quite separate. And that's just been a choice that has been done historically. Part of my PhD research is finding out why we've done it like that and can we be doing it better. There's a lot of different places across the world which will have emergency management and search and rescue together. And I'm sure there's some pros and cons for that. But what we've seen in New Zealand is that there has been instances where the search and rescue sector and the emergency management sector have come together to play in a real response. And it's happened with some really mixed results. So we had the Canterbury earthquakes in 2011, and Tony can talk to you quite well about that. He was really involved in the coordination of it. Initially, Civil Defence didn't really want much to do with them. But after a while, when they actually understood the skill sets and what they were able to do, they became part of the coordinated response. In 2020, we had the Southland floods, and this is when I was one of the EMAs down there. We had to evacuate people out of Milford Sound. Milford Sound's this very beautiful area that all the tourists want to go to. And we had to aerial evacuate 617 people out of there. And that was my responsibility. So being a practitioner, but also a search and rescue volunteer, we needed manpower. I happen to know where we can get that from. So it was a really good example of understanding the teams, because it was my team, and being able to implement them into an emergency response, and it was really successful. And we didn't lose a piece of luggage and had no fatalities. So for some reason, that's our big win from that. Whakaari White Island eruption. So Matt was quite heavily involved in this, and it was a horrible tragedy that occurred that day. But we actually had Coast Guard, and in New Zealand, Coast Guard's all volunteers, and they were involved in that response as well. So it just goes to show we can be pulling in those resources. The Westport floods, I've only mentioned Westport 1 and 2. However, that's the place that's currently flooding at the moment, and we get quite a few events there at the moment. This seems to be the way that the atmospheric rivers like to go. But again, in the Westport floods, the groups there had a really good relationship with the police. And so they worked quite closely with police, providing rescues and support for evacuations. And our most recent one was last year in 2023. I'm not too sure if you've heard about that, but it's caused quite a bit of trauma for a lot of people. It's probably the major cyclone that we've had in a number of centuries. There's been a lot of reports have come out of it and a lot of after action reviews. And search and rescue groups from across different regions were deployed for that. Some of them self-deployed, some of them were asked to deploy with civil defence groups on behalf of police. And some of it went really well, some of it didn't go too well. And so there's still a lot of reviews that are going on there. It's really interesting because the Ministry of Transport is responsible for search and rescue in New Zealand. They're the ones that have the mandate to deploy. However, as an emergency management advisor, if I need search and rescue in a response for an emergency management event, I can't just go to those teams and say, hey, I need you. I have to go through police, and then police have to make a decision, and then they want to make a decision based on who's going to fund it, and then they want to make a decision based on who's got the PCBU or the health and safety responsibility, and then they want to know who's going to be in charge of it. And then it gets too hard, and then they go, actually, you know what, we can't be bothered doing this. We'll just use a contractor down the road that has no understanding of our incident command systems or our processes or anything else for that matter. So that's quite often what happens. So during Cyclone Gabrielle, I was pre-deployed to Auckland, which is one of our major cities, because that's where we thought the brunt of the cyclone was going to hit. Fortunately for Auckland, but unfortunately for the Hawke's Bay, it decided to flick around at the last minute and absolutely slam into the eastern side of the North Island. And so a lot of this, even though it's come out of the reviews here, this stuff here is probably more related to my personal experience working in the Emergency Coordination Centre. We did use the amateur radio emergency communications teams, but we found that their radios were not compatible with the radios that we were using on the ground. There was a reluctancy in the ECC around verifying of the training of these search and rescue teams and how consistent it was across the different groups. There was confusion around the lead agency versus the responsible agency. And again, because we were in a national, or then I think we were in a national state of emergency, civil defence was the lead agency. However, police was the responsible agency for deploying these assets. But with the confusion with that, a lot of these groups didn't quite understand the difference, and so they were unsure of the reporting lines and who they were reporting to. So it got really confusing. So this went, we're not going to use you anymore. But of course, they're already there. They're already deployed. They're going to do something because that's human nature. And they did. Teams that were tasked, there was no reimbursement avenues for them. In New Zealand, we have under Section 33 of the Civil Defence Act, anything welfare related or anything humanitarian response related, that can be reimbursed 100%. So there were stories of surf life saving here. They were to go do evacuations and pull people off roofs. But then someone gave them a bunch of food and water and said, hey, can you take this to the other side of the river, drop it off there so that community has resources? And they went, yeah, of course. That became a welfare and a humanitarian response. Because they weren't tasked to do that, Civil Defence said, no, we're not going to reimburse you for it. So there's a lot of these types of stories that came out of it that create a lot of anger and a lot of anxiety. And it really discredited both organisations to a point, because Civil Defence would say, well, search and rescue aren't trained properly, they don't understand our processes, they don't understand our systems. And then of course, not Landstar, but search and rescue NGOs would say, well, they told us to do this, but then they don't give us anything for it. So it's a bit of a shambles, but through debriefing after action reviews, it's certainly something that we recognise, and it's something that we're moving forward with. And a lot of it just comes down to education. And it's always as simple as that. With any kind of after action review we get, it's around that education, the communication factors, and understanding the incident command systems. And here's some photos. So most of these are taken from the Gisborne and the Hawke's Bay region. As you can see in search and rescue in New Zealand, we wear a lot of orange, just like the Red Rocks team. So that's how you can generally tell us apart. And we do quite often work together as volunteers with the other volunteer agencies. It's just sometimes we don't work well with civil defence. So from a civil defence perspective, there's a lot of opportunities that I see as a researcher, as a practitioner, and as a policy person. And that's, deploying search and rescue organisations and volunteers or unpaid professionals. They're accustomed to operating in challenging conditions because that's what we do. When that person's out there lost in the bush and it's torrential rain, no one else is going out there, but we sure will. We don't have a problem with it. We're generally self-sufficient, and we're generally able to mobilise quickly. I don't know about you guys, but I've always got my SAR gear packed just in case I get a call out, and it's either in my SAR room because I'm a nerd, or on the back of my car, and I can just basically grab it and I know it's all in there. And then when I come back from that event, I unpack it, repack it, so then I know it's there. So we're normally able to be mobilised quite quickly. We operate within the ICS framework, and I find a lot of volunteers or a lot of these unpaid professionals actually know, we use SIMS, so we use this coordinated incident management systems. So a lot of the volunteers I work with actually know SIMS better than a lot of the paid professionals who are paid to know these things. But it's because they're passionate about it. So they want to learn, and they want to know that when they are deployed, they're doing the best they can for their communities. They have diverse capability, and that includes that specialised expertise. So whether it's from ropes, whether it's dogs, whether it's canyoning, whether it's caving, there's a lot of diversity and expertise within these teams. And most importantly, they have community trust. Most people who work within the search and rescue sector or volunteer are community champions, and so they already have that community trust. However, constraints. There's that operational risk. Who's in charge of them? Who's responsible for their health and safety? What if they get hurt? What if they get injured? Oh no, too much. We don't want to think about it. There's also operational risk in regards to, well, we don't know how well they're trained. We don't know how consistently they're trained from team to team. So that's a risk to anyone sitting in an emergency coordination centre. The coordination challenges in general, the who's who and who reports to what, and why do they report to that? The difference between a lead agency and a responsible agency. A lot of logistic issues. Of course, we have, everybody has their own assets. If we pulled those assets together, we'd be able to achieve a lot more. But when we're using these assets individually, we're not actually taking advantage of what we have. And so there's a lot of issues around that. The community expectations that are related to it, and that can be detrimental to search and rescue organisations, because you set such a high expectation within the community, because what you do is amazing, but then you come along to something like a civil defence event, and it's, and I want to say this nicely, but a cluster, and then as volunteers you wear that as well, and that's not fair. Resourcing constraints and training inconsistencies, I've already touched on that. And a lot of this is in the Bush International reports, which have recently come out. So if you want some really depressing reading, I recommend it. So of course, looking at collaborative strategies, and this is nothing new. Like, I don't want to stand up here and tell you how to suck eggs, but joint training. You know, having those relationships with, if you're a policy person and you work in emergency management, talking to your local SAR groups, talking to the researchers and the academics that are around. Because if you bring them all together, you can achieve some amazing things. Chances are you're all thinking the same thing, or you've got a different piece of the puzzle. You just need to be able to bring that together. And you may have another couple pieces missing, but you can work on it together. And it's amazing how many times, and particularly working in the capital city of New Zealand now, that I will go to a PhD catch up and talking to my lecturers, and they've got an issue around tsunami evacuations and orange lines. And then I'm back at work, and one of my colleagues is like, "Oh, I'm working on this problem around tsunami evacuations and orange lines." And you're like, "Oh, wow, that's interesting." And then you've got your SAR teams going, "Oh, yeah, we've just done some experimentation on the fastest route to get out of here." And you go, "Yeah, well, maybe all three of you should get together and have a bit of a chat." But it's very true. Coming together, sharing ideas, it really does pay off, and doing that in peacetime before we end up in a response. Information sharing and coordination. So that's a really big one for us in New Zealand at the moment. We have some really, really strict privacy laws, and it makes it really difficult to share information. But where and when you can, again, coming back to those trusted relationships, sharing information that you have, because you may find that someone has another piece of the puzzle. Yeah, resource integration and mutual aid. Again, you know, we've all got these different pools of resources. By bringing them together, we're actually able to achieve more and better outcomes. Standardized procedures and protocols. Wow, wouldn't that be nice? And it's really not that hard. Again, talking to each other, you know, swiftwater rescue. This is what we do in swiftwater rescue. What do you do? Oh, okay. Well, how about we come up with a common standard? Best practice. Don't be silly. But it is, and it's a big thing that we tend to have in New Zealand is what we call tall poppy syndrome. So it's particularly common when it comes to, particularly to research, and I'm finding it quite a lot in the space I'm working in at the moment, is whenever you have ideas that may be a bit different, people don't really want to know about them. So it's really hard to share them. Or you're working with people who have been in the industry for such a long time that new ideas, they just don't see the value in them. So that's why, you know, having those conversations and actually coming together to share those standard procedures, those protocols, so that we can actually create something of purpose. After action reviews and continuous improvements, one of my favorites is lessons learnt. And we see it all the time. Those lessons aren't learnt. You know, after action reviews and debriefs, they're not lessons learned. They're lessons identified. They're not learned until you've identified them. You've gone back, you've practiced them, and you've came up with a different outcome. And until then, it's just a lesson that's been identified. You haven't learnt it. Because how many times have you read an after action review or an evaluation report that has said the same thing over and over again, year after year after year? We're not identifying them. We're not learning from them. We're just identifying them. And what are we actually doing with that? So coming back to that effective communication, resource sharing models, and joint response strategies. So coming together, actually talking to each other. And it doesn't just have to be researchers, practitioners, and what else am I? Oh, policy people. It can be all different types of organisation. It can be community groups as well, because everybody has a piece of the puzzle. And everybody has something to bring to these kinds of joint strategies. And of course, the topic that everybody loves is the integration with community and volunteer management. Now, this is something that I'm very passionate about, particularly from a previous life where I used to work for the Red Cross. But what we do find is, how many times have you been on a SAR mission and you've had spontaneous volunteers turn up? Yeah, it's quite common in New Zealand, particularly with children or people of high standing, or someone who's quite popular. And there's always some mixed responses on what we should do with those volunteers and how to manage them. Well, we have the same issue in emergency management. You have people that really want to do good and they're there for the best intentions, but how do we actually manage them? So if you want to know more, come see me later. I can tell you all about it. No, but the gist of it is that we do have people in the community who are quite capable and quite competent. So we need to be looking at strategies on how we can incorporate them into these types of responses. So that way they can help rather than hinder. And it is just a bit of a reality. And one of those, some of the research that's coming out of New Zealand at the moment through the various emergency management events that we've had is actually using our search and rescue groups as shepherds because they are community champions. They know the community, and chances are they are able to navigate some of the bullshit that goes on in the community as well. And so they are a huge resource from a volunteer management perspective as well. So if for whatever reason we're finding we can't deploy them for health and safety reasons, we can still get them to help us from an emergency management perspective to help coordinate those spontaneous volunteers for other activities. And that's right, we're almost at the end, guys, so just bear with me. So what can we be doing to adapt to climate-related disasters? Does everyone have a business continuity plan? Yeah, excellent. So people laugh, but business continuity planning is just really up there in what we should be doing. Because if you have a search and rescue group and you don't know what they're going to be doing in the event of emergency, well, then how can we actually deploy them in an emergency? But it's also part of your day-to-day activities as well. If you don't have a business continuity plan, well, then it's going to make it really difficult for you to deploy for SAR missions in general. If you're running low on numbers, well, are you able to talk to groups who are next door and to be able to support you and to back you up? If you've got a long weekend where a lot of people are going to be away, do you know how many of the SAR groups around are in the same position? You know, business continuity planning doesn't have to be boring. You can make it fun, but it is something that's really important to have and to be thinking about. Understanding of the local context, and majority of SAR groups do. But when you're working with emergency managers like me, I quite often get deployed to other regions across the country. And I have no concept of the local context. So being able to lean on SAR groups and my SAR contacts is really important to understand the context that I'm going into. Community engagement and partnerships. And this is really important. It's about that SAR prevention, but it's also about that emergency preparedness as well. We're looking at, and I think I've spoken to this already, is that integrated approach of working together, talking to each other in peacetime, building those relationships so that when something does happen, we've got resilience that's already been built. We've got that integrated approach and we're able to be deployed in a efficient and coordinated way. Of course, investments in technology and innovation, really important, as what we've seen with today, and some of the progress that we're making here at Syrotuck is really mind-blowing and just loving it. But we also need to remember that sometimes it's good to go back to basics as well. Understanding the basics is what's going to allow us to really take hold of the innovation of the future. And I know this was brought up prior to one of the other presentations, but cultural competency and cultural diversity. We are a diverse, both culturally and we're just diverse in general. And our SAR groups really need to reflect that, as well as our emergency management groups, because we are the people that we are helping. And so they need to be able to relate to that. And then, of course, that environment, sustainability, and degradation. So there's a lot that happens with this, with climate-related disasters, and we need to find ways to adapt really quickly because our environment changes very, very fast in these types of events. So recommendations. I'm pretty sure most of this is pretty clear cut. But collaborative governance. So when it comes to policymakers, they need to be reaching down, or they're down, to the practitioners and to the researchers to find out what's currently happening, and what's going to be best leading into the future, not just the now, not just the past. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of policymakers look at. They look at past events and they go, oh, well, it would have been really good if we had that now, rather than predicting forward. And like what we've seen with that diagram, 2014, we had 0 declared states of emergency. Last year, we were in 90 days. So looking at those projections into the future and making policy based on that, and talking to the people who are actually working on the ground. Integrating that policy, investing in preparedness. That's the first thing that gets cut with any kind of policymakers is now we'll just focus on response. We won't focus on preparedness. But if you focus on preparedness, that really, really does help you in response. And when we have the lack of collaboration with governance, then looking from SAR teams to emergency management sectors, MOUs and service level agreements. But ideally, it would be great if it could just be written into legislation and that we just completely redid the whole idea of emergency management in New Zealand. Hopefully not too many Kiwis are watching this today. Practitioners, I meant what I said. Continuous training and skills development. It's certainly something that practitioners need because I've been in the role in New Zealand for about 7 years and I'm constantly training and I do not know it all, but I've met people who have been in there for a lot less than I have and they think they know it all. I think once we get to a point where we think we know it all, you've become redundant to your team and you've become redundant to search and rescue. So keep learning, people. SAR prevention, and of course, building relationships. Those relationships are just key. And when it comes to researchers, interdisciplinary research, we quite find because there is a reluctancy of practitioners and researchers to talk to each other because they talk two completely different languages. We're not seeing the research collaboration that we need. So if you have an idea of research as a practitioner that you want to see, then talk to the research agencies because chances are they want it, they just don't know how to go about it. So we need to be seeing more collaboration, and that's where the likes of the Syrotuck is really important. Impacts assessments and evaluations, so identifying those lessons, not just learning them, but identifying lessons learned and finding ways where, identifying lessons identified and finding ways to ensure that they are lessons learned through practice and reevaluation. And then, of course, looking at the innovation and technology development and how that relates to policy and the practical aspect. And when you put all three together, you end up with evidence-based practice, which we all love. And that's it. Cool. Questions? No, excellent.
Well, I have a question for you. Do you have any recommendations for either the SAR volunteers or those of us industry plants who have found our way into emergency management to kind of help? I mean, as climate change is creating more disasters, they're not suddenly getting more time on their hands to help, their own job in this, and they're seeing much more responsibility in different ways. So, do you have any suggestions for how to maybe we in the field of SAR help elevate this on their priority list or kind of get in front of the face of those people making those decisions and plans and spending their time on what they see as most valuable?
Yeah, good question. I think understanding your own environment is really important and the impacts that these climate-related changes are happening. If you're finding that, areas that are starting to flood, which never flooded before, talking to your local emergency managers is really important in building those relationships with them. And there's different ways that you can do that, and I certainly don't have the answers with it, but I certainly know when I was working in the south, the very bottom of the South Island, we had it's basically a slow slip. And it wasn't until one of the SAR groups came to us and said, hey, this slow slip that's happening, we're concerned about it. And it would have been really easy for us as emergency managers to go, we'll look at it another day. But we thought, actually, they've come to us and we'll take a look. So we took a look at it, and we were able to survey it, and we could see that it had moved quite significantly enough that we ended up having to close that road that went in. They did another engineering report on it, and they ended up having to build a bridge on the other road because it was becoming too dangerous. So I think a lot of it comes down to building relationships, knowing your local environment and the local context, but also knowing the context of the different groups and the different regions around you, because chances are if you were to be deployed for something, it's probably going to be to support another group as well. Don't know if that answers your question.
What are some of the best ways you think local SAR teams can prepare themselves for the disaster environment?
Build an ark. No, I'm kidding. How they can prepare themselves for the emergency management environment. Yeah. Again, business continuity planning is really important. Understanding what types of adverse events may impact you. And, we're not just talking climate-related disasters, we're talking any kind of natural disaster. Natural disaster is the space that I work in, but of course, a lot of you probably work in, some of that terrorist space as well. That's something I know absolutely nothing about, but just having an understanding of what's around you, what type of situations you may find yourselves in, and then just ensuring that you've done your readiness checks, ensuring that you have your equipment and resources that you need. And if you don't, identifying what those priorities are. And the big one is training. And, when you don't have anything else, you can always fall back on your training. And that's really important for search and rescue, for emergency management, and just for anyone working in that space in general. Yeah.
So given the increase in these climate-related disasters, would you have a recommendation on an increased time frame for a jurisdiction to do a vulnerability assessment, to kind of take a look, maybe when was the last time that was evaluated, et cetera? Because it looks like it's happening more frequently than before.
Yeah, probably about 10 years ago. Because we are seeing, from an Aotearoa New Zealand perspective, because we are seeing these increases happening so quickly, we're very reactive in our response. And every time we try to be more proactive, building resilience within the community, doing readiness programs, we end up in response again. So about, oh goodness, 6 years ago, we switched from the Ministry of Civil Defence to the National Emergency Management Agency. There was initially about 30 to 60 people in the ministry, and the NEMA has now moved to about 240. So it grew very, very quickly. And believe me, at the time, there was not 240 emergency managers in New Zealand. So they pulled them from central government and didn't necessarily have an understanding of emergency management. And around about that time, that's when we saw it felt like week after week having these emergencies thrown at us. So we haven't had a chance to do that. We're in the process now where we've recognised that, and that's happened more from a regional level. And the regional agencies have gone, actually, we can't keep doing this. So we're doing a lot of risk and assurance at the moment. We've got all of our different groups have our group plans. They're due to come out from a legislative perspective. And a lot of risk and hazard analysis is going into that as well. So there is things happening slowly, but it's purely from a risk and asset base. It's not as much from a community impacted base. What I'm really pushing for as part of my PhD is actually integrating search and rescue as part of the national emergency management response. But it is also a case of whether search and rescue groups want that, whether it's fair on them to have to be able to do that if it's mandated, and also how can they keep up with those current standards with it. So there's a lot to it, which is why it's a PhD project. But yeah, the risk and assurance stuff is something that really needed to happen a long time ago, because could we have predicted that this was going to happen? Potentially, yeah, but we didn't.
Anything else?
Paul Brown asks, with limited resources, if New Zealand was consumed by a severe weather incident or overwhelmed, what other countries' MOUs does New Zealand work with?
Very good one. So we work, because we work within the Sendai framework, we have agreements with various countries. Australia is normally the first one to respond. So they support us quite heavily. In the most recent severe weather cyclone that we had, we also had USAID come over, and they supported us. We've got different agreements with different military across the world, and the international urban search and rescue groups as well. So we're all part of that connection too. And then from a humanitarian perspective, at the National Emergency Management Agency under operations, we have international volunteer management, which coordinates that response as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Aly.